Great, so yeah, thanks for that introduction. So my name's Lucia. I'm a senior engagement specialist for banks at IIGCC. And for those of you that aren't familiar with IIGCC, so we're an investor organisation composed of over 400 institutional investor members that we bring together to address climate-related risks and opportunities. So today I will be presenting, sorry to skip past our disclaimer, today I'm presenting two pieces of recent work produced by IIGCC. So the first is a practical initiative to tackle the lack of standardization in sustainability KPIs, and the second is a report to support investor engagements with banks on decarbonizing real estate. So the first report is called, it's a white paper called Aligning Real Estate Sustainability Indicators, and it was produced led by my colleague Hugh Garner at IIGCC, who's a senior specialist for real assets, and he led a working group team composed of really key industry players, and you can see some of them listed there. So it was a real team effort. Why did the working group produce this report? So as you know, a huge amount of financing is needed to decarbonize buildings. I believe about $600 billion US dollars annually up to 2050. However, the proliferation of frameworks, so both voluntary and mandatory frameworks, is creating barriers to investment, as it can reduce comparability, increase reporting burdens, increase confusion, and also just general nervousness around greenwashing. So the working group set out to address existing ambiguities in sustainability KPIs within the European legislative framework. And the white paper itself sets out a methodology to provide some technical suggestions to addressing ambiguities within these indicators. The goal of the working group was really to harmonise existing frameworks. It wasn't to reinvent the wheel or to create further market fragmentation, or to create further standards. So the RESI working group, as I mentioned, it reviewed European regulations and identified these 10 climate indicators, and that's across the commercial real estate sector. So the assumptions, the ambiguities and data sources were identified by the working group, and they came together to show how these assumptions and data sources could be aligned across the sector. The group also developed a data quality hierarchy, which goes from tier 1 to tier 5 sources, which essentially sets out most preferred sources to least, with most preferred being the original source from where the indicator originates. So for example, here you can see EPBD for indicators 1 and 2. So just a note on the process. So the white paper was the product, of intensive consultation, and the methodology was also piloted on real-world assets. The methodology was then updated to reflect this real-world application. We found that following the consultation, 100% of the respondents said that they would adopt the proposal with only minor modifications, so that's a great success. So maybe just to bring this to light in a kind of more concrete way, I've just got an illustrative example of the first KPI. So that's nearly zero energy building. And you can see that in the box, it's defined as having a primary energy demand below defined NZEB thresholds. The sort of ambiguity or challenge that was identified, however, was that there's no tier 1 source of NZEB thresholds per nation. So as you can see in the orange box here, the working group obviously discussed possible data sources and agreed that CREM would be a good interim kind of source for indicator 1, as it's widely accepted as a market benchmark and has good geographic and sector coverage. So this is sort of a simplified version of the methodology and a flowchart, but there's a lot more detail on each indicator within the white paper. So just to sum up on this one, so what's next for a RESI? So firstly, we intend to engage industry stakeholders, encourage them to align to the proposal to encourage greater consistency across the 10 indicators. The next is to engage with the regulators on appropriate and ambitious sustainability regulation, and of course to iron out these ambiguities. And then in the longer term, one of the working groups addressed these ambiguities in key climate transition indicators. They'll tackle further challenges, so for example, financial product labeling, potentially physical climate risk, biodiversity, embodied carbon, social values, and as many other things. So just to wrap this part up, it's important to note that it does not intend to be a final solution, but it's a practical initiative designed to support industry alignment and progress. So it's additive and it will evolve with ongoing discussion. And we do hope that in time, governments and legislators will clarify the ambiguities and harmonise these indicators, which would nullify the need for kind of an interim solution like this. So the next paper I'll just briefly run through is a report called Engaging the Banking Sector on Decarbonising Real Estate. This was led by myself under IIGCC's Banks Engagement and Research Initiative. So just first a bit of context on the intention of the report. We developed this with our investor members to provide a guide or a resource to support investor engagement with banks, to support informed engagement to a banking sector that is often highly exposed to real estate, whether that's through commercial or residential portfolios. And there's obviously a risk element here where, left unmanaged physical transition-related risks can translate back to risks to investors. But there's obviously a huge opportunity as well associated with decarbonising the real estate sector. I think it's also fair to say that for the sector, many of the decarbonisation technologies are fairly clear, and what's really needed is to tackle issues like regulatory inconsistencies, which we've sort of touched on, data gaps and policy needs and so on. So the report is structured as a set of possible questions that investors might ask banks. So, for example, either in an engagement meeting or look for in a bank's disclosures ahead of an engagement meeting. And it's structured across these 5 areas here. And just to be clear, we're not setting out a standard. The questions won't be relevant for all banks in all contexts. It's really just, as I mentioned, a guide or a resource to support investor engagement. And we hope that it will be a real catalyst for dialogue, and would love to hear feedback from you as well. So, and of course, I should note on the first report, please do hunt me down at the drinks if you'd like to learn more, and I can also put you in touch with my colleague who led the report. So I'll just very briefly run through the 5 areas at a high level, but missing quite a lot of nuance here, so I encourage you to have a look at the report itself. So the first area is around climate governance, and while this is obviously a clearly important area, I won't dwell on it too much, as a lot of the expectations or questions here should be fairly unsurprising. But the headline ask is whether the bank's real estate strategy is consistent with its broader approach to meeting climate objectives, and whether robust governance processes are in place. So, for example, incentive structures, oversight measures, and whether resources kind of filter down through the organisation. The second area is on exposure, risk assessment and reporting, and a slightly more chunky area. So here we're looking to understand whether the bank has disclosed its exposure to residential and commercial real estate. And this is obviously, which along with emissions disclosures, is obviously quite important from a materiality perspective. Following that, it's quite important to understand the bank's risk assessment process for both transition and physical related risks, and how these translate back into risks to capital. We then also expect material risks to be disclosed in the bank's financial statements, its accounting, and also any relevant capital adequacy disclosures. And this is quite important because overlooking these risks could lead to misjudged default risks and hurt both share price and investor confidence. The next area, third area, is on target setting. So the investors that fed into this report would like to see banks set their own ambitious and achievable targets, and this can help set a trajectory for both decarbonising commercial real estate and residential real estate. And complementary to these targets would be targets for sustainable finance. Both are quite relevant. As, for example, if only sustainable finance targets are set, banks could meet these targets with only products focusing only on properties that are already, highly efficient, energy efficient. And to understand the credibility of the targets, it's important for banks to disclose their pathway, baseline, and methodology. If banks don't set the targets, and we find often for residential real estate that there are challenges for setting targets, we're just kind of keen to understand why. What are these challenges? And it can be really handy when banks disclose, certain dependencies within their reports as well, and if they have any plans to expand coverage. And then just to note that throughout the report, we emphasise the importance of focusing both on energy efficiency and emissions intensity. I think Anna spoke a lot about energy efficiency and the importance of that. And currently what we see are that most of the targets are on emissions intensity basis and cover scope 1 and 2 emissions, with obvious data challenges around scope 3. So the next area is implementation roadmaps. It's really important that targets are adopted with a credible strategy. So here we'd like to see, understand the bank's net zero strategy for decarbonising real estate and disclose of any progress. So as part of this, strategy, it might set out its plans to provide finance, its advisory services, and its expertise to transitioning assets. It's worth noting that in the report we emphasise the importance of a whole life carbon approach given the significance of embodied emissions. And another aspect that I'd also just emphasise is it's interesting to know whether a bank's strategy differentiates between financing already efficient real estate assets versus financing efficiency improvements of renovations in buildings looking to decarbonise, and that obviously has implications for real-world decarbonisation as well. And then just another area here is focus area is we heard from Mr. Santamunis on the importance of the implications on low-income households this morning, and so it's important to understand whether, to emphasise that the transition does not marginalise people and communities and is socially just. And so here investors would like banks to disclose how it integrates just transition considerations as well. So just to wrap up on this section, another aspect to mention is that the report focuses on the importance of assessing and disclosing physical risks and plans for adaptation and resilience. This is important as banks could expect impacts from increased credit risk and issues relating to insurability, and we emphasise the importance of joined up thinking when it comes to addressing transition and physical risks. So efficiency improvements and enhancing resilience should really be looked at together, as this can be more cost effective and reduce the risk of maladaptation. And then finally, I just emphasise the importance of client engagement and if the bank has disclosed its approach to engaging its clients. So this is obviously setting out quite a lot, and obviously we understand that that it's incredibly important to have an enabling regulatory environment. So the last area is just on engagement. So that's both engaging with policymakers and regulators, as well as just the broader ecosystem and key industry players. And this is just obviously really important to kind of make progress in all of these areas that I've mentioned. So that's really it. So yeah, just to wrap up, both of these reports are very important as they've had a lot of investor feedback and input. The first report, as I discussed, sets out what needs to happen in order for investors to make effective investment decisions, and the second sets out examples of what good can look like when it comes to a bank's approach to decarbonising real estate. So yeah, there's the QR code, and if you have any questions at all, please do find me afterwards. Thank you.